Georgia and Armenia share a mountain border in the South Caucasus. They both declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Both experienced devastating wars in the early 1990s, Georgia in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh. Both had populations of roughly 3 to 4 million people and similar levels of Soviet economic development. Today, Georgia's GDP per capita is $7,800 and growing. Armenia's is $7,000, also growing, but through a radically different mechanism and with a radically different risk profile. These two countries, which look similar on the surface of any standard economic comparison, are pursuing fundamentally different models, and the data over the next decade will tell us which model works better in the South Caucasus. This is that story, from the beginning. Both countries inherited from the Soviet Union an economy that had been designed for integration, not independence. Georgia had tourism potential, a wine industry of global quality, citrus agriculture, and significant Soviet military infrastructure. Armenia had industrial capacity concentrated in the defense sector, a highly educated population by Soviet standards, a substantial diaspora concentrated in Russia, France, and the United States, and the Metsamor nuclear power plant, which still generates over 40% of Armenia's electricity. Neither country had oil, neither had gas. Both were landlocked, with geography that limited economic options. The early 1990s were catastrophic for both. Both lost wars in those first years. Both saw GDP collapse by 50% or more. Both lost population to emigration on a massive scale. By 1995, Georgia and Armenia were among the poorest countries in the former Soviet space. The subsequent divergence was not inevitable, it was chosen. In November 2003, Eduard Shevardnadze, Georgia's post-Soviet president and a Soviet-era foreign minister, was removed from power by mass protests following a fraudulent election. The Rose Revolution, as it became known, brought Mikhail Saakashvili to power on a platform of radical reform. What followed over the next 5 years was one of the most concentrated anti-corruption campaigns in post-Soviet history. Georgia's traffic police had been systematically corrupt since Soviet times. Drivers paid bribes to avoid fines. Police used their positions to extract income. No fee was ever for the stated purpose. Saakashvili disbanded the entire traffic police force overnight in 2004 and replaced it with a new institution built from scratch with higher salaries, public accountability, and cameras. 40,000 government officials were fired. Customs administration was rebuilt to eliminate bribery opportunities. The World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index moved Georgia from 112th in 2006 to 8th in 2015, the fastest improvement in that index ever recorded. Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index showed Georgia moving from among the most corrupt post-Soviet states to among the least corrupt in a single decade. Foreign direct investment followed the institutional reform with a lag of approximately 2 to 3 years, as investors waited to see whether the reforms would hold. They held. By 2012, Georgia was attracting foreign investment at rates that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. GDP per capita approximately doubled between 2003 and 2012. Armenia's growth story is different and in some ways more surprising. Armenia has the worst geographic position for an independent economy in the entire former Soviet space. It is landlocked. 2 of its 4 borders, with Turkey and Azerbaijan, are completely closed due to unresolved historical and political conflicts. The Turkish border has been closed since 1993 in solidarity with Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The Azerbaijani border has been closed since the war that ended in 1994, then the 2020 war, then the 2023 offensive that resulted in the complete Azerbaijani recapture of Nagorno-Karabakh and the exodus of virtually the entire ethnic Armenian population of the region. Armenia trades primarily through Georgia and Iran, both expensive and logistically difficult corridors. Despite all of this, Armenia's economy grew at rates consistently above the regional average for much of the 2000s and 2010s. The primary drivers were remittances from the large Armenian diaspora, IT sector development that benefited from a highly educated population, and, after 2022, an extraordinary influx of Russian capital and human talent fleeing sanctions and mobilization. By some estimates, GDP growth in Armenia reached 12% in 2022 and 2023, partly driven by Russians relocating money and operations to a country that was not under sanctions. This growth is real in the data. It is also structurally fragile because it depends on conditions, specifically the Russian flight capital, that could reverse. Two wars shaped both countries' economic data more than any policy decision. For Georgia, the 2008 war with Russia over South Ossetia produced a brief but sharp GDP contraction and a significant increase in Western attention and support. EU membership negotiations began to accelerate. The EU signed an association agreement with Georgia in 2014, and Georgia received visa-free access to the EU Schengen area in 2017. The war, paradoxically, may have accelerated Georgia's Western integration by demonstrating clearly to Georgian voters and Western governments which direction the threats came from. For Armenia, the 2020 war with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh ended in a decisive military defeat after 44 days, with Armenia losing more than half of the territory it had controlled since the 1994 ceasefire. The political and psychological shock was enormous. The economic consequences were measured but real: reduced regional standing, political crisis, leadership change, and a fundamental strategic recalculation of the country's relationship with Russia, which had failed to intervene despite a security alliance. The 2023 completion of Azerbaijan's recapture of Nagorno-Karabakh and the complete displacement of its Armenian population added another layer of strategic trauma. The trajectories now are diverging faster than at any previous point. Georgia has applied for EU membership and received candidate status in 2023, though the ruling Georgian Dream Party's behavior since then has raised questions about whether EU integration remains the actual government priority. If integration proceeds, the data precedent from the Baltic states and Eastern Europe suggests a significant growth acceleration over 10 to 20 years. Armenia, having experienced Russia's failure to honor its security commitments in 2020 and 2023, has begun a notable Western pivot, reducing its participation in Russian-led structures, importing French weapons, and opening dialogue with the EU and United States about security partnerships. Whether Armenia's Western pivot translates into economic integration, investment flows, and institutional reform comparable to Georgia's post-2003 trajectory is the central economic question for the Armenian data story over the next decade. The data does not yet have an answer, but both countries are at inflection points where decisions made in the next 2 to 3 years will determine their economic trajectory for a generation. Subscribe to the Collapse Index. New data every week.